Vamos a hablar el día de hoy cómo garantizamos que la prosperidad sea compartida por todos.
Para esta primera sesión del día 2 acerca de cómo asegurar que la prosperidad sea compartida por todos. Please welcome to the stage.
Sean bienvenidos todos y también denle la bienvenida al
Economía 2001 y profesor de la Universidad
Joseph Stiglitz.
Para hacer la presentación que él se merece.
In order to carry out the presentation he deserves, we ask the president of INEGI, Dr.
Well, welcome everyone. I hope you have a wonderful dinner yesterday. Thank you, Governor, for the dinner. I think it was splendid to give us a taste of Mexico and a taste of Jalisco. Thank you very much indeed for the dinner. Well, we are really, truly honored to have to start this second day of the forum with Joseph Stiglitz. Of course, we all know who Joseph Stiglitz is. Nevertheless, let me give you a few highlights about him that makes him uniquely qualified to share with us his ideas on how to ensure that prosperity is shared by all. Joseph Stiglitz is professor at the Columbia University in New York. He received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 and helped create a new branch of economics called the Economics of Information, exploring the consequences of information asymmetries. He was formerly also chief economist at the World Bank and also head of President Bill Clinton Council of Economic Advisors. He's not only one of the world's leading economists, but I think he's the one who has made us rethink what we have thought about the working of economics, of how the economy works. He has made us rethink general beliefs that trickle-down economics works, or that markets are self-regulating and efficient, and that any government interference with markets is a mistake. But I guess most importantly for this forum, he has combated the idea that inequality is good for growth, that there is a trade-off between growth and inequality, that there is a cost of reducing inequality in terms of economic growth. In 2008, he was asked by the French President Nicolas Sarkozy to chair the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, the so-called Stiglitz-Sem-Fitoussi Commission, where they push for broader measures of progress beyond GDP. And also he is co-chair of the high-level expert group that continues the work on measurement of economic performance and social progress. So he has not only made us rethink what we thought about the working of the economy, but also he has made us also rethink about how to measure economic progress or the measurement of progress. Professor Stiglitz will share his thoughts on how to ensure that prosperity is shared by all, and also give us an overview of the work of the high-level expert groups and the work ahead of this group. Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here again. When I say again, it's because I've been actually here in Guadalajara for the book festival, which all of you should visit if you can. And again, as the fifth meeting of the OECD, a series of meetings which have done more than anything else to bring the idea of how we measure GDP, how we measure well-being is important, and that we can do a better job than GDP. What I want to do today is focus on one aspect of this measurement problem, and related to one of the most important problems our societies face: how do we ensure shared prosperity for all? It's obviously a very big agenda, and I'm only going to talk on one aspect of it. I do want to emphasize the point that was made in the introduction, that our understanding of this issue has changed dramatically in recent years. It used to be thought that there was a trade-off. If we wanted to have more equality, we'd have to give up an economic performance. Now there's a broad consensus that more equal societies actually perform better, that we can have both better economic performance and more equality. For this talk, I want to focus on 4 key questions. What is meant by prosperity? What is meant by shared prosperity? What can be done to achieve shared prosperity? And what is the role of the new metrics in achieving this goal? So to begin with the question of what is meant by prosperity, obviously it's more than income and consumption. That has been the main thrust of the work that is being discussed here today and at this conference. It involves health, education, security, both economic and non-economic security, and opportunity. It entails all the dimensions of well-being that the OECD has highlighted in its recent reports. Of course, real secure prosperity has to be sustainable. In our earlier SSF report, we observed that many aspects of sustainability could be reflected in the value of certain assets, in the value of certain stocks, like our natural, social, and human capital, as well as physical capital. But we also emphasized that there were certain aspects of sustainability that could not be summarized in a value metric, and that one would have to use physical data to represent the indicators of sustainability. Here, however, I want to focus on a different point, and that is the relationship between capital, as economists would understand it, and capital as ordinary individuals understand it. From the point of view of most individuals, financial capital is seen as part of their wealth. But in terms of societal prosperity, we refer to real assets, the real value of capital goods, the real natural, social, and human capital. The important point is that much of the growth of measured wealth is the growth in financial capital and the value of land. And that was highlighted in recent work by Piketty, where he talked about the enormous increase in the wealth-income ratio. But the wealth that he was referring to, the increase in that wealth, was not an increase in the value of the productive capacity of the economy. It was an increase mostly in the value of land. And the disparity between the two has a lot to say with the sustainability of well-being. In fact, when one looks more carefully at the data, it becomes clear that the value of the productive assets per capita is declining in many of the advanced countries. And almost surely that is the case, for instance, in the United States. I now want to turn to the second part of the question, what is meant by shared prosperity? The measurement of this issue, of course, has been something that
tiene que ver con los economistas y otros científicos sociales por mucho tiempo. Uno no puede resumir una cosa tan compleja como la distribución de probabilidad de los ingresos.
Statistic, just as one can't summarize anything as complex as the well-being of society by a single number like the GDP. Economists have tried to do that by focusing on a number called the Gini coefficient. But what is the high-level expert group, which is the successor to the SSF Commission, has been trying to ascertain what properties of the income distribution are most salient for addressing the problems, the challenges facing our society today. And for many of these purposes, the Gini coefficient is probably not the best summary statistic, and that we'll probably have to use more than one statistic to reflect adequately the changes. A lot of discussion about poverty at the bottom, a lot of discussion about the increase in the inequality at the top, the 1%. And these trends obviously are not necessarily fully reflected in that single number, the Gini coefficient. But it's also the case that as we try to assess what is going on in our society, and as we talk about shared prosperity, we have to talk about the distribution of income, consumption, and those various other items that are opportunity that I talked about before. We have to talk about across social groups, gender, ethnicity, regions, age, disability. Many of these, of course, were emphasized in the recently adopted SDGs. Disparities across certain groups are particularly socially unacceptable and particularly costly. For instance, giving rise to strife, social and political, and even economic instability. So one of the objectives is to understand what aspects of inequalities, what aspects of the failure to distribute equally are particularly relevant for affecting economic, social, and political behavior. There are particular difficulties in assessing equality of opportunity. In the discourse about inequality, there are many people who say we don't care about inequality of outcomes, we care about inequality of opportunity. Now, many of the politicians who actually say that really don't care about equality of opportunity either. What they really want to do is shift the discussion away from the current topic onto something else. Because I feel this very strongly, because in the United States, we've achieved the dubious distinction of having the highest level of inequality in income of any of the advanced countries. But it's also the case that we have the dubious distinction of having one of the highest levels of inequality of opportunity, as conventionally measured, of any of the advanced countries. And of course, recent research has highlighted the fact that, not a surprise, because there's a very high correlation between standard measures of inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcomes. Here I want to emphasize one aspect of what is obviously a very complex topic. When we talk about inequality of opportunity, what we're talking about, at least in part, is the intergenerational transmission of advantages and disadvantages. And those are an important part of a characteristic of all of our societies, but in some societies, those intergenerational transmission is much stronger than others, inherently implying that those at the bottom don't have equal opportunity. I tell my students that the most important decision they have in their life is to choose the right parent. And if they don't make that decision right, life afterwards is going to be very difficult. But another aspect I want to highlight is that providing the same opportunities for individuals in differing circumstances is not providing equality of opportunity. That people who start at a disadvantage, just giving them the same education will mean that they will be disadvantaged and that the outcomes will be different. And so this highlights the difficult challenge that we have in trying to become more precise about the concept of equality of opportunity. Let me spend just a few moments talking about the nature of trying to understand better the inequalities. It's a simple model which you can see what is going on. Income is focusing now just on inequality of income, and I don't need to remind you that that's only one dimension of inequality. But in terms of income, income is simply assets times the return on the assets. Of course, assets times return on assets is market income. And then you add to that or subtract from it taxes, transfers, and taxes. This simple identity gives you a way of framing issues of inequality. Inequality in income can be related then to inequality in the asset ownership, itself related to intergenerational transmission, inequalities in the way the government allocates assets through human capital. It's related to inequality in returns to different assets. For instance, changes in the skill premia. And finally, it's related to inequality in transfers themselves. In most societies, those are directed at offsetting inequalities in market income, but sometimes I think in some societies they are intended to augment inequalities in market income. Now, there are a large number of forces giving rise to changes in these inequalities. There are globalization, technologies, changes in norms, changes in politics. But one of the things that we've observed in recent years is that countries with similar economic structures have markedly different degrees of inequality. It's not like this, on the different sides of the Atlantic, there are different laws of economics. The laws of a demand and supply, or whatever the laws of economics are, apply equally among countries with similar economic circumstances on both sides of the Atlantic. There's a very strong implication of that, and that is it is policies, our rules, regulations, institutions that are crucial. In a way, this is a very helpful note, because while inequalities have been increasing in most countries around the world, if those inequalities were a result of the laws of nature, the laws of economics, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. In some of the states in the United States, there's a belief that you can change the laws of nature by passing legislation. In one of our states, they decided that it was inconvenient for pi to have so many digits, 3.1614, so on, and went on. So they passed a law that in their state, pi would only be 3.16. But of course, that didn't change the ratio of the circumference to the diameter. You know, that was a law of nature. But if the inequality that we have in our society is a result of the policies of what we do, we can change it. And that is the hopeful note that this recent research has brought to the fore. There's one particular point I want to emphasize. In many countries around the world, the rules governing our economy and our society have been rewritten over the past 30 years in ways that have led to more inequality. I see this most forcefully, say, in the United States, where beginning around 1980, many of the rules and regulations governing our economy began to be rewritten. We began a grand experiment, you might say, of rewriting the rules. And those rewriting of the rules, like lowering tax rates and liberalizing certain markets, were supposed to bring faster economic growth. Many admitted that it would lead to more inequality. But the view was that with the size of the economic pie growing so much, everybody would be better off. Well, we now have a third of a century of data. It's been a long-term experiment, not a short-term, and we can see the outcome. They were right that it led to more inequality. But they were wrong about it leading to more growth. It actually led to lower economic growth, with the result in the United States that basically the bottom 90% of Americans have had stagnant income over the last third of a century. So if you had asked them then, 30 years ago, a third of a century ago, we have some great ideas for you. Here is a set of reforms that is going to make the top 10%, and especially the top 1%, and even more the top 1/10 of 1% better off. But the bottom 90% of you will see stagnant income over a third of a century. Would most Americans have chosen that particular set of reforms? Well, that was a rhetorical question. I think the answer is no. But that's not the way it was phrased. The result of this is that in both market income and in the offsetting transfers, there's been an increase in inequality. In terms of market income, there have been changes in labor market institutions, rules leading to wages lagging productivity. It used to be that productivity and wages moved together. Now, for the last third of a century, productivity has continued to grow, doubling, but wages have stagnated. There are changes in competition, financial and corporate governance rules, and their enforcement, leading to more income at the top, more ranks, and more rank seeking. As I said, there are large differences across countries. Some did more extensive rewriting of the rules, with the result that there is more inequality in market income. Some worked harder to offset the intergenerational transmission advantage, with the result that there is less inequality in market income. And some worked harder to offset the initial levels of inequalities and impacts of technology and globalization, with the result that they have experienced less of an increase in inequality. And in some cases, particularly in Latin America, there have been several countries which have seen a decrease in inequality, admittedly from very high levels. So the important implication of this, as I said before, is that we can do a better job of creating shared prosperity through policies which purposely and continuously address inequality in all of its dimensions and with all of its causes. Now, just as a brief advertisement for a book that's coming out, but this is not meant a commercial advertisement because you can all download it now free. One of the rules that's important are intellectual property rules that have restrained access to knowledge, and we don't want to do that. So this is called Rewriting the Rules. So it's an agenda that tries to show how you can rewrite the rules in ways to get a more efficient economy and more shared prosperity, going through basically all the rules, and in our case, the American economy, but this is becoming an agenda and a movement to do it across different economies. I now want to come to the final topic of my talk, the importance of metrics. And all of you, of course, know about the importance of this, so I hardly need to repeat this, but let me say it anyway. Metrics are key to monitoring and diagnosing what is going on, what is happening to well-being in all of its dimensions, and how different groups within our society are being impacted. It's absolutely vital diagnostic tools. We have to assess the locus of the changes in our society, and we have to motivate civic action. And it's all predicated on the argument that we put forward in our earlier report. What we measure affects what we do, and of course what we don't measure affects what we don't do. So both sides of the coin are true. I remember many years ago under President Reagan, there was a move to stop collecting poverty data. It wasn't the view that if you stop collecting poverty data, poverty would go away. But the view was if you don't collect the poverty data, maybe people won't notice it as much. And then we won't have to spend as much time thinking about this issue. So this was really a very conscious a sense of consciousness before we began talking about the importance of metrics. He realized that metrics were important, and he wanted to change the metrics to make sure that we don't pay attention to something that I think is very important. Well, the thrust of the work of the SFS report and what has happened in the last decade is that much is left out of our standard metrics. And I'll illustrate that just with 3 items, and of course all of you are working on different aspects of this issue. One of the most important for citizens in all countries is security. The undermining of systems of social protection have weakened security, especially in the bottom and the middle. And this is especially true, for instance, in some of the afflicted countries and the crisis countries in the Eurozone. When we talk about what has happened in these countries, we talk about GDPs, and Greece GDP per capita is down by 25%. But we don't really fully grasp how serious things are, because the insecurity that people there feel, the recognition that their retirement security, their health security, their job security has all been undermined. When the youth unemployment, as it is in Greece, is over 50%, 60%, there can't be any security. If the overall unemployment is 25%, you know that if you lose a job, the likelihood of you getting another job is very weak. I talked before about the importance of looking at across different cohorts. People who lose their job in the 50s in countries that don't have good retirement security and good other forms of security know that they are unlikely to get a job the rest of their life, because we don't have good systems of bringing people as they get older back into the labor force, of retraining, at least in many of our countries. So the point is that the increases in true inequality, not only in Greece, but in many of our countries, is much greater than reflected in the standard statistics. As a second example, the labor share includes part of CEO and banker pay. After all, bankers often get a lot of bonuses and things like that that may not show up in the labor share, but their basic salary, a few $1 million, does show up in the labor share. And so when we talk about the labor share only going down by a little bit, that doesn't really reflect what's going on in our societies. Because in that labor share is the banker share. When I say the banker, it's the whole top strata. So what's dramatic is we've done in the United States, Olivier Giovannini has done some really interesting work where he's redone the labor share, excluding the top 1% of labor. And that number has fallen dramatically, in the case of the United States, from around 80% down to 65%. So the overall labor share has changed a little bit, 5 percentage points, which of course in income data is a big deal. But the point is that the change in the share in labor is a small fraction of the change in the share of the labor of the real laborers, the bottom 99% of people who think that they're working for a living. So again, that implies the increase in true inequality may be far greater than reflected in standard statistics. The third example has to do with the aftermath of the Great Recession. There's overwhelming evidence both in the United States and in Europe that there's been a decrease in potential growth. And what that means in turn is that if we look at it carefully, we see that output related to the input of labor, as we conventionally measure, and input of capital, as we conventionally measured, is lower. Something has happened. Our growth path has moved down permanently, and even in the United States, where we're beginning to grow, we're growing at a slower rate, but even though it's at a slower rate, it's from a much lower level. And in Europe, they're not even growing, things are even worse. The fall is greater, and the recovery rates are even, the gap between where they were and where they are in growth rates is larger. Well, that suggests that we have left out something in our metrics. We have left out something about what has happened in this case, to the stock of human capital. There's a lot of discussion about human capital. We typically look at the number of years of education. But the most important part of human capital is on-the-job training and even education that goes beyond the job. So formal education is only one part of human capital. But there can be no on-the-job training if there are no jobs. So that what has happened in Europe is, well, people normally in their 20s and 30s are spending time getting more skills, becoming more socialized in the labor force, becoming more productive. In Europe, and with the Great Recession, particularly in the afflicted countries, they're not acquiring those skills. And so if we had a better metric of human capital, we would realize that the consequences of the flawed policies are far greater. In other words, we talk about GDP, one way we think about it is consumption plus the change in the capital stock. But the capital stock that we typically talk about is the physical capital stock. But there's also a human capital stock that we don't usually measure very well. And what we should be realizing is that the flawed policies in the Eurozone are leading to a decumulation of this very critical part of our human capital stock. And therefore, the sustainability of GDP is actually lower. So the reason I emphasize this so importantly is because these are examples where our metrics affect what we do. One would hope that the governments realized how significantly they were affecting not only current variables, but future variables, how they were affecting stocks, that they would have taken stronger actions. Better metrics would have shown that the cost of the austerity policies were far greater than many critics claimed. Better metrics can thus better assess what is going on, provide better information, on the basis of which we can formulate better policies to enhance societal well-being and ensure shared prosperity. The objective of the OECD high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, the successor of the SSF Commission, is to help identify the lacunae in the existing metrics and existing systems of data collection, to help understand relative merits of different data sources, and to help develop these better metrics. Just to give you two examples, to monitor the evolution of the intergenerational transmission of inequality, we need longer-run panel data. And as I said earlier, the Gini coefficient is probably not the best way to capture what is going on with the marked changes in inequality and inequalities of opportunity. So in conclusion, let me just say this conference presents an extraordinary opportunity to discuss and share with each other these advances, to see how these ideas have already proved useful in understanding what is going on in our complex societies and in formulating better policies for addressing key challenges for facing our societies. And I want to thank the government of Jalisco, to thank the Mexican Statistical Institute for hosting us in such wonderful surroundings and for their wonderful hospitality that has provided such a conducive environment for this exchange of ideas. And thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz. We will open up the floor for some questions. But let me ask you first, you said that you tell your students, I guess, to stress the importance of social mobility, that the most important choice they have to make is their parents. I guess second to that, most important choice probably would be you have to choose the country you are born. And of course we will, but then you said that we can change the rules. And of course, we will read your book now, and if it is free of charge, we can download it. But if you were asked to pick up the 1 or 2 or 3 most important rules that countries have to change in order to promote more equality societies, which one will you choose? That's it.
Yeah, that's a very hard question because it's such a long list that I don't know where to begin. I think let me just mention a couple. One of them that I think is absolutely vital is the rules that lead to full employment versus unemployment. So you don't even think in the rules of the game about monetary policy. But a monetary policy that focuses excessively on inflation and not enough on employment is going to wind up with more unemployment, and we've seen that in countries around the world. More instability, as we saw again before the 2008 crisis. And the result of that is that if people don't have jobs, it's the most important source of inequality. So that's, and there are a whole other set of things. The second thing I guess I would say, particularly for opportunity, obviously, is the education system. But here, I think the most important thing is having a good public education system where everybody in society has the same opportunity. What in many of our countries is we're gone to private education systems that allow the children of the more advantaged to go to better schools. So it's the structure of the education as well as the level of education. I think the third is a whole set of rules related to labor market and financial market institutions. So what we've observed is that when we started changing some of the labor market institutions, that was designed to weaken the bargaining power of workers. And it worked if your objective was to lower the wages of workers and to lower their share. At the same time, changes in the financial sector and corporate governance have enabled the 1% to get a larger share of the pie. And the changes are enormous. The fraction grabbed by the top 1% in the United States has doubled in the last third of a century. And the share gained by the top 1/10 of 1% has increased by almost fourfold. So these are dramatic changes. But I want to emphasize one other aspect that you mentioned in your introduction. Many of these changes have led to a less efficient society, a less efficient economy. So some of the changes in financialization and the way our corporate sector works have led to short-termism, that the companies are thinking about the short-term returns. And the result of that, you can't invest long-term. You can't invest in people. You can't invest in technology if you're thinking about the next quarterly return. But we created a financial sector and a corporate sector that focuses almost exclusively on the next quarterly return. So what's so dramatic over the last third of a century, we actually created a less efficient economy.
Thank you, Professor. Let me see if we have some questions from the audience, 2 or 3. There are one there, and then the second one over there.
Clara Husidman.
My name is Clara Husigman. I wanted to ask you if you don't think that the serious omission that has been historically made about considering the role of families in building human beings or creating human beings. I mean, the foundation of human being resides within the families, and they give you life knowledge. this has been systematically omitted, and that's why we think that formal education or work education that do that. The transformation experienced by families around the world has been horrific based on the austerity policies and the policies of salary depression. The times used by families to child rearing and caring for children and young people have been reduced. For instance, in my country, we have seen an increase of children and young people that are growing up alone. There is a breaking point in sharing knowledge, and I think that has not been considered just yet. It's something that there is there, and that's something that the family will be naturally doing.
More questions? Just, I will ask you to be brief so that we have some time for Professor Stiglitz. Is over there. And then over here, Salvador.
Okay, first I want to say thank you to Professor Stiglitz so much for the work that he's doing, that it really has furthered the work that I'm doing with grassroots activism and many communities I see doing, so thank you. I really honor your work. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned trade-offs. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the implications, the drives, and the dangers in taking a trade-off approach towards well-being. And my other question is, what do you see as the role of grassroots activism and community-based work in this movement towards well-being, happiness, and sustainability for all?
Thank you very much. Here, Salvador.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Professor, I would like to ask you a very specific question about a topic that is highly important in these times. People like me who had the opportunity to live in innovative places or countries such as Silicon Valley have seen the effects of innovation in reducing inequality. However, there is a big debate about the role of innovation as a potential factor of inequality reduction or an inequality increase factor. Because in the end, innovation usually takes place in specific niches where a company or startups pull an entire sector. And this triggers compared to the rest of the society. I would like to ask you in particular for you to state your stance about the benefits of fostering innovation at societal level as a whole. Thank you.
Okay. So on the first question, I think that illustrates an aspect I should have talked about in answering to your first question about what are important rules. One of the important sets of rules govern labor force participation of women and of families. So for instance, in some countries, there's family leave policy. There's parental leave policy, sick leave policy. In the United States, there's almost none of that. In some countries, the state provides child care facilities. In some cases, they don't. All of these add up together to not only facilitate women participating in the labor force, but the question that was posed actually highlighted another aspect. It also facilitates the ability of members of the family to interact with their children, because in the home is where a lot of education can go on. So these are examples of how there are policies and structures that seem off on some other tangent, but actually are core to the creation of a shared prosperity. On the second question, let me say 2 points. One of the reasons that it's been important, I think, to emphasize the fact that we could have faster, better economic performance and more shared prosperity. In fact, I would argue you could only form of real prosperity is shared prosperity. The reason why it's important to emphasize these as complementary, especially when you get to the extremes of inequality that we have in many of our societies, is that if there is this trade-off, if there is a trade-off, then people say, oh, I understand your concern about inequality, but the price of inequality is too high. The price of reducing inequality is too high. And that's why I wrote my book called The Price of Inequality. What I was trying to say is actually we're paying a very high price for our society, for our economy, for our democracy, of having this high inequality. So it reframes the debate. The other question related to grassroots movements, in our original report, which is mismeasuring our lives, why GDP doesn't add up. One of the things that we emphasized was the importance of these metrics as motivating a national dialogue about what was important. That we realized that you cannot capture everything that is important in statistics. You can't quantify it in terms of money, but you can't even necessarily capture everything in quantitative terms. Even though as statisticians, you try to get everything into some numbers, you can't capture everything. But what the numbers can do is provide a basis of a dialogue in which civil society has to participate actively, in which you are saying, what haven't we not captured? What have we captured but imperfectly? What are we leaving out? Like the question about, are we leaving out something about what's going on inside the family? There are also very big issues of the distribution of income and consumption within the family that we never used to pay attention to, and when you gather data at the household level, you deliberately ignore that. And so that's the kind of why having a civil society discussion is so important, because you bring in voices of people who are thinking about things from very different perspectives. The question of innovation is really a very challenging question. Let me put it in a couple of different ways. In principle, innovation is improving our opportunities. You can get more output from less input. So how could you oppose innovation? Innovation allows us to do things we couldn't do before. So in that sense, innovation, you have to say, is unambiguously positive. But we also have to realize that innovation has very big distributive consequences. Kuznets described the early stages of development, which is a kind of innovation, is that some groups pull out ahead of others, and that means that there's going to be a growth in inequality. That was the argument originally for the Kuznets curve, that there is a growth of inequality. In many of those cases, those people who benefit aren't harming those who are left behind. But in the nature of a lot of you call it disruptive innovation, the people who are left behind are actually harmed. That the innovations actually take away the livelihoods of other people. Here in Guadalajara, there's a discussion about Uber and what it will do to the taxi cab drivers. And what that illustrates is how important it is to manage innovation. Now, some of these innovations are not real innovations. The financial sector's innovations did not lead to more economic growth. The financial sector's innovations were really better ways of taking money away from other people. And they were very clever. I give them a lot of credit for it. There have been a lot of innovations about how better to exercise monopoly power. Microsoft was fantastic in that. Okay, so you have real innovation, but it's not, that part of the innovation is not wealth creation, it's wealth diversion. It's taking from one to another. Now, in the context of Uber, for instance, part of the innovation is an innovation of how to avoid taxes and regulations. That is to say, we have regulations about trying to avoid congestions. We have regulations to protect customers, insurance regulations, and we have taxes. It's important in our societies to be able to have taxes collected that benefit everybody in society, that can use to build the roads and to provide schools. We need those tax revenues. And some of the innovations undermine the ability to collect taxes, and some of the profits of the innovations are actually related to circumvention of the regulatory frameworks and of the tax frameworks. So the bottom line of all of this is we have to first assess what are the real innovations versus the pseudo innovations. And secondly, we have to always manage the innovation. The principle that if it's a real innovation, everybody could be made better off is one we have to keep in mind. But the fact that everybody could be made better off doesn't mean that they will be made better off. And that's where strong government sharing policies of the kind I talked about, how do we create shared prosperity? It's exactly directed at that. Yes, we've increased the production capabilities of the economy. How do we work now to make sure those production capabilities are of benefit not just to a few, but to all of our societies?
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. You give us very interesting ideas to take for the following panels, but also for the following days, months, and probably years. Thank you very much indeed, and let me congratulate Professor Stiglitz with an applause.
Muchas gracias a ambos.
Thank you, Joseph Stiglitz and Dr. Eduardo Sojo. Please give a round of applause.